Hello, and welcome back to Igniting Imagination. I'm your host, Lisa Greenwood, and joining me is my good friend and co host for this season, Shannon Hopkins. Hey, Shannon.
Hey, Lisa. Oh, it's great to be back.
Yes. So, we've named many of the common threads that run through our season on facing reality and claiming leadership: the challenge of polarization, the decline of the dominant system of the church, the need to slow down and rest in the midst of an accelerating age. Our guest today, Dr. Randy Woodley, will speak to these realities through the unique lens he offers as an Indigenous American who has spent his career as an activist, farmer, and scholar, active in ongoing concerns of racism, diversity, eco-justice, reconciliation, ecumenism, interfaith dialogue, mission, social justice, and Indigenous peoples. Randy is a Cherokee Indian descendant recognized by the Kiowa Band. He is recently retired from serving as Distinguished Professor of Faith and Culture at George Fox Seminary and soon to be on the faculty of the Center for Action and Contemplation. Now, Randy and his wife Edith are the founders of Elahe Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Elahe Farm and Seeds outside of Portland, Oregon. Through Elahe, they invite people to a new relationship with creation and model sustainable farming practices and earth justice. You can learn more about their work in our show notes. So, this was a rich conversation with Randy. And Shannon, you had experience with Randy's work before this conversation. I'm curious what is meaningful about his work to you and what you heard in particular in this conversation that has stood out to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I encountered Randy's work through his book on practices, the 100 Days to Living Differently with, and how can we learn from nature? And I'd had several people refer that book to me, and I thought it was so practical. And, Randy doesn't mince words. And there's
Yeah.
some hard things that come up in his conversation. And to be honest, I think, the issues around like land back and how we really deal with um, our origin stories as
Yeah.
it relates to Indigenous peoples, it's complex. And he really tries to both acknowledge the complexities, not mince words about it, but then give us practical ways through. And how do we begin living differently with nature? And I think it's such a gift to the church in this moment. And to be honest, in this moment with climate catastrophe, I think it's the gift. If we will really work to reconcile, and I think it's the gift that he brings and people like him bring to us in this moment. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think his work's meaningful because of that. I think it does bring a gift, but I also think it's not without challenge. But most good gifts aren't, I find these
Right.
days.
That's an important word. Most good gifts aren't without challenge, and I mean, I appreciate that you're naming how challenging this is, and I'm a little embarrassed to say that I don't have this voice, a voice like his in my life very often, and I'm struck by how challenging it is to me, and how grateful I am that he ties it so deeply into faith, and it's not. I guess the part that is sort of confessional to me is that I have tended to think of my lens is so Western and so white when I look at my faith. And so when I hear the resonance with scripture and the resonance with Jesus's teachings, with what he's saying, it both challenges me and inspires me. And so I need his voice. I need in speaking into me and challenging the way I think about how I see the world and how I see, like you said, our origin story in the United States, particularly, and how I understand what it means to enter into um, these conversations from a faith perspective, understanding the call of Jesus to love well, to understand us as a part of creation, and what that means for how we interact with each other and the world and creation.
Mm,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I'm with you. I need it more, and it's so easy to just be in our own history,
yeah.
trajectory, story. Um, it makes me think too about Pauline Boss's comment about it when she was talking about ambiguous loss in our origin story. It's like,
Mm,
oh, interesting how these two conversations actually do go together as well.
wow, that's a great intersection. So if you all, as listeners, haven't listened to the Pauline Boss episode, I encourage you to do so. So let's listen to our conversation with Dr. Woodley. Dr. Woodley, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
I've been so looking forward to this. This season is all about facing reality and claiming leadership. And you are known for having this amazing capacity for sharing difficult truths in a spirit of love and acceptance. And so I'd like to start by inviting you to share some of those truths with us as we continue to name the reality that we're all facing. And I think especially related to the issues that you've long written and spoken about, things like eco justice and diversity and racial justice. And what are some of the difficult truths that we need to understand as a people?
Well, that's a great first question. I appreciate it.
Let's just
Drop
jump right in, right?
the bomb right away, right? So, yeah, I'd say, first of all, thanks for the idea of speaking the truth in love. It's kind of hopefully been my moniker lately, but I certainly didn't start out that way.
Mm.
I, I was pretty abrasive in the old days, but yeah, I finally, I think, got to the place where I want to be able to love people and love the earth and
Mm,
love community creation and treat us all with respect. So, yeah, I think the main thing that most of us are missing is the effect that the Western worldview has had on not just our world, but the church in particular.
mm,
And we look at things like 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 we're being neutral or objective or whatever, and we have no idea how much we've really been affected by the Western worldview and the Platonic dualism that came about over 2,000 years ago, and all the sort of subsidiary spin-offs of that dualism and how it's affected the church so much. And this is exactly why we have basically a non-embodied, disembodied theology.
mm.
Right? So we think that's okay, but that has nothing to do with what Jesus taught.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't teach a disembodied theology. In fact, he taught that basically your faith comes by your actions, as opposed to your beliefs.
Mm,
So I like to say, Jesus really didn't care much about beliefs. He challenged some groups of Pharisees at many different times. He, picked corn on the Sabbath. He, talked about the ox being in the ditch on the Sabbath. He did all kinds of things that people got upset about, religious people, and we're right back to the place where the Pharisees were. Now we're like,
mm,
it's what we believe. They had the argument between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Do you believe in the resurrection or do you not? And basically, we look at that. We look at that through our theological lenses for the past couple thousand years that have been formed mostly by Western dualists in Europe, Western men who are dualistic, platonically dualistic in Europe, and we've come up with a sort of a worldview and a theology that was never meant to look at the scriptures that way. The people who wrote the scriptures were more like indigenous people. They wrote the stories that they wrote, and 90% of scripture is story. Not with the idea of is this did this happen? Is this true? And but what is the truth in the story?
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the main points that we're missing. We have looked at the scriptures and said, "Oh, we have to prove or disprove this." So, more progressive folks try to prove something didn't happen sometimes, like parting of the Red Sea. Oh, it was the Reed Sea and it was only 2 feet deep and there was a strong wind, and that's how it can be. And more conservative folks, no, it did happen and God came through in the and either of those are the wrong question. The question is, what is the truth in the story that we need? And so and that's the way that the writers wrote them, and intended them to be interpreted. So that's just sort of a big swipe here at first.
Yeah.
We don't really know how to interpret the scriptures, and they haven't for several thousand years.
Yeah. So that big swipe, as you say, the big broad brushstroke of dualism and disembodied faith, uh, connect those dots to the work that you've been doing around eco justice and
Well, let's talk
self
another a big
diversity.
swap.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
that's the idea of salvation. So, one of my professors, one of my theology professors, was um, a Free Methodist, and that's Howard Snyder. I don't know if you're
Hmm.
familiar with Howard Snyder, but he wrote a book called "Salvation is Creation Healed." And he wrote that after our native guys came through and were his students, and I think we might have influenced that just a little bit as well. Um, but it's a wonderful book, incredible book. I've used it in my courses that I've taught. But the idea is that a much better word for our understanding of theology today, instead of salvation, is healing.
Mm.
So,
Healing.
for
So,
example,
so.
now is our healing much closer than when we first began, right? Um, and that sort of idea is not just for us, but it's for the whole, what I call the community of creation. So the idea of restoration, salvation, if you will, healing is for the healing of us all, not just for my individual healing. And so that's another subsidiary of this dualism, is the individualism, right? Hierarchies, individualism, all of these external, extrinsic classifications and categorizations. All of these things are sort of tied into this dualistic idea. But but if we don't begin to understand, like, the world that the people lived in and the worldview that they had was about everything around them. It wasn't just about like their soul or you know that's or and we see in evangelicals have not known what to do with these passages, like the Philippian jailer and all his whole family was healed, right? So so we're interested in what we've been doing is trying to create a holistic model of following Jesus, and caring for the whole community of creation and the whole world and the whole community, and that includes the body of Christ, of course. But we're not this little bubble that gets Jesus all to ourselves. This is Jesus is big enough for everybody.
Yeah, I love that. Interestingly, I'm going to segue a little bit, but when I first came to the UK, I felt like that I was starting to hear people speak like that, that it's salvation is about the healing of the whole. It's God's redemption of everything, the environment, household. So I love the way you're bringing that in. I'd love you to talk a little bit, Randy, about just like the fact that you are Cherokee descendant, and I'd love to know what your experience as an Indigenous American in our country has been, and how that has shaped your experience of racial justice and how it's leading your work. And yeah, I'd just love for you to share a bit.
So I was raised by a couple people, both mixed blood Cherokees, who were pretty assimilated, and so I had to go outside the home to find any sense
Mm.
of traditionalism or those kinds of things. Um, and I did. I'm from a young age. I started sort of searching for those kinds of things, And then finally, after I spent my 2 years in Alaska with Native people as what I call my missionary oppressor years. I learned all the
Mm,
things that I shouldn't be doing, and as a result, did some deep study, and went to what's now Palmer Seminary, and got what I needed. I think there, it was not only getting the sort of the holistic gospel, but I was getting the opportunity to do research in my own among my own people, and then finally, after that, went to Oklahoma, spent time with a lot of traditional people, and was able to sort of look and go, "Oh yeah, this is the worldview that makes sense. This is the worldview of my ancestors. This is the one that I need to be looking at everything with, like the scriptures and everything else." So that had to be sort of rebuilt for me. Like we all, we're all indigenous from somewhere, right? Like our people survived somewhere
mm,
for thousands and thousands of years as indigenous people, and then they start getting in civilizations, and then those civilizations all crumble one after the other. Um, and so we just need to remember that we're all indigenous in one way or another. I make a difference between capital I indigenous, the people who are on this land at this time and have been here for thousands of years, and small I indigenous, which includes everybody. Um, and indigeneity really means how to live with the earth and the community of creation around me, not just on the earth. And so, yeah, and that's been really helpful. I've had a lot of elders in my life throughout the years who have helped. My wife and I have spent a lot of time learning together from various elders who adopted us and took us on and helped us. And so, when I challenge people to change their worldview, I know it can be done because I had to work on that myself, and of course I'm not where I want to be, but I'm not where I used to be. So yeah.
yeah. Regan. So I would love to hear you talk about the gift of indigenous spirituality and what we can learn from it and what you have learned and what you can share with us and how that has informed your work. But I'm also interested in what the church can be learning from indigenous spirituality.
Yeah. Well, so I listened to a couple of your podcasts, and I think there was a whole lot of truth being spoken, but I think it's it's truth that comes doesn't back up far enough, right? So
Hmm.
there's things behind these things. Like when we talk about the church, we don't really have a good idea of what the church is supposed to be. Um, what we've created is some kind of like a model that is premised on, you know, um, sort of corporate reality and corporate structuring and those kinds of things. Uh, Probably spiritual authority that doesn't that's based on hierarchy as
Mm,
opposed to people working together, which is always a better idea. Those are um, and sort of a corporateness as opposed to individualism, and these are the kinds of things that have created what we call our American values. Excuse me, but our American values are pretty well um, set opposite of what the values Jesus taught are.
mhm,
And so, indigenous people have a much closer reality and much closer values to the teachings of Jesus. I always say the first dilemma in America with the Puritans and Pilgrims was, they met people who actually had more Christian values than they did, but had never heard of Jesus. And so, and I think that's where we are today as well. Our indigenous people have a lot to teach the church if the church is willing to listen. Now, the church is pretty much in a place, as one of your podcasts said, where it's, at best holding its own, um, and at worst in serious decline. And so what we need to get back to and figure out, like, well, why is the church not working? Because it's not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be built on,
mm, mm,
cooperativeness and corporateness and holisticness, embodied theologies and not disembodied theologies, and not doctrinal statements as opposed to our beliefs, as opposed to what we actually do with our lives. What we
Mm.
Native people, what you do is what you believe. And so, and I think that's pretty much what Jesus taught. So, there's just a whole lot of things, but it takes going back and saying, wait a minute, I have been affected by a worldview that was so totally wrong. It's a failed experiment. It's gotten us to the brink of extinction. And if we don't change that worldview, we're not going to have time to change the church, because I'm not sure humanity is going to survive. So we've got to be serious about re-evaluating our values and our theologies and our whole worldview. And I think Indigenous people are at least on this continent, and maybe many others as well, but are the people who can sort of get us going there and get us moving in the right direction. So yeah, it's a lot of people say, well, that's a big job. It seems like a lost cause. Well, I think God deals especially with lost causes, right?
Yeah, very true. Um, I you just said a minute ago we've got to get serious about this, or humanity might not exist, might not be around. And I'm thinking about your recent book, Becoming Rooted, the 100 Days of Reconnecting with Sacred Earth, which I have and really have enjoyed. I wonder if you could talk to our listeners about why becoming rooted in the earth is so important, and what can we learn from connecting more with creation, and why this is so important at this moment in time in your mind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, and this is nothing new, of course, right? I mean, the oldest book in Scripture, Job 12:7 and following, is this wonderful scripture. Ask the animals, and they will teach you, or the birds of the air, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish of the sea inform you. So, this is not a new idea, but because we have had such a disembodied theology and such a parochial sort of bubble, like God's only at work in the church, right? Um, that we've not been able to see the whole picture. And so now, talking to animals, talking to the earth, um, asking the trees to teach us, those kinds of ideas, that's considered animism now, right? Because we've lost touch with our own indigeneity. So it's important now to sort of reclaim those kinds of values. If we're in what I call, people have called this the Patricene, right? So, or the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene means it's human caused. What's happening in with climate change and the sort of brink of disaster that we're teetering on. And I call it the Europatricene, because there was a particular worldview that's responsible for this, not all peoples, but it was particularly Europeans, a European worldview, and it was particularly a male-dominated hierarchy of worldview. And those are the people who were writing everything. And wonderfully, we're discovering all kinds of writings by women now and other people, and from the past. But that's what dominated our worldview. And so, if we're not going to have this male-dominated European worldview, then we've got to say, well, what else is there? One of your programs was talking about adaptation. Adaptation is something that we learn from nature. I mean, that's pretty much the number one rule of nature, is to adapt. And what's happening to the earth right now is that the earth is adapting, and the earth is saying, like, well, you know, people weren't meant to be the major consumers. I've got this whole thing I do with, like where energy comes from and how it's the most energy that's spent, who consumes the most. The bottom line is that large mammals like people are way down the list. We're what we call tertiary consumers. But right now we become the primary consumers. and it's throwing everything off balance. We've drained the earth of its resources. We've sucked out the aquifers and pulled out petroleum and coal and all the rest. And so the earth is responding, and the earth is basically saying, enough of this. Deuteronomy has a great sort of a phrase that I think fits this perfectly. It says, and it was talking about spiritual pollution, which this is also, by the way. When we treat the earth that way, that is spiritual pollution. But it says that the earth will spit out its inhabitants. And that's exactly what's happening with climate change. We're seeing, 100-year floods, you know, 3 times in 5 years in some places. We're seeing droughts in places that never exist before. The increase of severity and frequency of hurricanes and tornadoes and all of these things. This is the earth spitting out its inhabitants. And as it says in Proverbs, the just suffer with the unjust. And so if we continue to allow this, if good people who say, wait a minute, these are not the values we want, continue to allow this, and this means getting into politics, right? It means getting in and lobbying. It means getting in and doing ground community organizing, ground level stuff. The church in America, the white church in particular, the black church has been pretty good at this, but the white churches said, oh, we stay out of politics. And that's part of that individualism. So
Hmm.
our systems actually have to be changed in order to heal the earth and bring things back into balance. So I wrote the book, Becoming Rooted, to I've written lots of other things to sort of challenge that from an intellectual and theological place. But Becoming Rooted is just sort of like I wanted to, like, if we're going to change, it's a constant thing. We have to think about it every day. So my challenge was, can I get people to walk with me for 100 days? And just sort of see things from an indigenous perspective. Not that I have all the answers. All those aren't my answers in there. They're my experiences. But our indigenous people that we've known and elders and others have. And so I wanted to just sort of write something short, because most people don't have a lot of time to read anymore, and just something that I could get people to walk with me for 100 days. And the feedback that I've gotten from that has been incredible. I had numerous peoples and groups do like 100-day journeys for that. And at the end, they talk about how their worldview has changed and things. And so the success of that book is I think proving that it can be done. And of course, I'm not the only one probably saying these things, but but that was the point of Becoming Rooted, was to try and get people to continually think about this change of worldview.
I so appreciate that you took what was and has been for you a, an important academic project, if you will, in terms of connecting those dots and making the argument and what we do in the academy. But you said what matters is, are people going to live it? And you put it into this resource, if you will, that's accessible and such. And the other thing you've done is you've said, okay, I'm going to live this. And you have a farm called Elahay. Did I do
Yep.
it?
Yeah, you
Yeah, and where people can come and learn about sustainable and regenerative agricultural practices and so much more. And so we have a cohort, in fact, that's going to be um, visiting and learning from you later this year. I'd love for you to share a bit of the vision and why it's important and what you all are doing.
So Elahay, the vision for Elahay came about in 1998. Um, and the idea was, so my wife and I have been involved in every kind of native work we can, every kind of native ministry. We were in Anadarko for a long time, and we were in, I was a sort of what would you call a DM, I think, and district minister. Is that what the Methodists have? Um,
DS, a
DS.
district
There you go.
superintendent.
DS. Sorry, I
Yeah,
got the terminology wrong.
no, that's good.
and uh, and so I had 10 native churches I was responsible for, and then I also ran a Christian center, which was a place for youth to come, and we did after school tutoring and computer learning. This was sort of when computers were just getting popular, and fixed up the building, and I think we had like 17 ministries going out of that place at one time with, to unwed mothers and houseless people, and after school tutoring and language programs, and
Yeah, wow.
all these different things that we've done throughout the years. But the whole thing is that the church and the government, hand in hand, basically set Indian people up to be dependent upon them. That was the goal. And so in a lot of ways, all of our denominations are still pretty paternalistic toward Indigenous people. Um, and we were always thinking like, well, what's a model, or what's a way that, well, what can we do that will empower our people and not make them dependent? And so we thought about that. I pastored for 7 years in Carson City, a native church, and experimented a lot there. And then one night I had a dream in 1998, and it was of this place, Elahe. The idea was it was a place where Indigenous people could come and be empowered, learning both life skills and sustainable farming, and because a lot of our people have land, right, and a lot of chronic diseases like diabetes are rampant in our Indian communities, and so in a school, in a cultural center, a place where we could practice our culture freely. Well, we eventually lost. We bought a place in when I was doing my PhD at the East Stanley Jones School. And you guys should be familiar with that, hopefully, at Asbury Seminary. And during that time, when several of us Indigenous guys were working on our PhDs um, in intercultural studies, we purchased a piece of land 7 miles from there, and 50 acres, and basically started that, and it was going like gangbusters, and
Mm.
but we lost it due to violent pressure from white supremacists. And so we lost everything. I ended up moving to Oregon, becoming a professor at Portland Seminary. But we had to start again. And so there've been now, and then the next place we were able to afford was a 3-acre farm. And that was just too small for the vision. So we looked, and we were there for 9 years. And then finally we were able to buy the property that we're on now, which is 10 acres, and quite diverse in its, in the environment that it exhibits here. And so, the idea was to bring people here, originally just Indigenous people. But what we found out along the way, really in Kentucky, was that if just Indigenous people get healed, and come back to their roots and that sort of thing, come back to an Indigenous worldview, that's not going to do a lot of good, because we all need that, right? And so it's not very holistic to just take one group of people and say, you know, let's heal you guys. That's really important. But we also found that there are lots of non-Indigenous people on the way, or white folks mostly, who were looking for this, or looking for like values that match the worldview that they wanted to have. And so those kinds of values, which I think are extremely important, um, and that Indigenous people hold, are the kinds of values that can not just heal us, bring us closer to Creator, and also, you know, I, I hate to say save the world or save the earth, because I think the earth's going to be okay, but maybe humanity's not, and so maybe
Mm.
restore or heal humanity.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a big task. And I used to think, oh, popularity was the way to that, right? So the more popular you become, the more people you can speak to, and that. But that's sort of, I think, more of a superficial view of how to look at things. And what we decided was, if we can just live our lives in one model of this, just how we live daily, and exhibit those values, and host people, that will have, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So that will have more influence in the long run, in our world. And so that's what we've dedicated our lives to do.
Oh, I want to come now more than ever. um,
I know. Right.
I just want to know that what's ringing in my mind, Randy, as you talk about this, is I'm thinking, where is the church, and how did leaders in the church begin to move towards this way of being and healing, towards healing? And I don't know, I guess I just wonder, I'd love to hear you just talk about what, when you think about the church and its work in the world, and as it relates to the healing of creation and a more embodied theology, what would you say to the church and to leaders leading the church today?
Yeah. So one of the big things that's missing, of course, is what and I wrote my first book on this, Living in Color, Embracing God's Passion for Ethnic Diversity. Um, and so the idea is, this whole idea of unity and diversity has been wiped out by our our individualistic, homogeneous, racism and the rest. And so we've created these categories that we feed into, and so, but God's world is not like that. Everything in God's world is built on the premise of unity and diversity. So because that's who Creator is. And so we have this fingerprint or DNA of God everywhere around us. There's nothing singular in the whole multiverse. Nothing. Even you go down to the most subatomic particles, which are called quarks now. They're inside atoms, right? And those quarks change colors and they move around and everything else. But there's never one quark that's alone, which I find very
Mm,
interesting.
Interesting.
There's nothing singular
yeah.
in the whole universe. And so,
Mm,
and it's all different. So we
mm,
haven't even embraced the differences when we think, oh, well, we're an all white church. Not quite. I mean,
Mm,
that's the American myth, right?
mm,
But we're different genders, we're different income levels, we're different jobs, we're different perspectives. There's a lot of diversity. We're just afraid to tap into it. And so a lot of
mm,
my students would say, I'm just sick of us being the all white church, and we're not growing that way. And we're not. And I'm like, I ask them, well, are you all like Republicans? No. Are you all Democrats? No. Are you all male? Are you? No. And so I'm like, maybe what you should do is explore all the diversity and learn to love each other in the midst of all that. And
mm,
then when you're ready, God will give you more diversity.
mm,
But the problem is that we've not allowed, women to speak by and large. We've not allowed people without education in a lot of churches to speak. And so what we don't realize is that this process, when we come together as community, it's the process that's important. But if only one or two people or three or a board or whoever is basically in charge of that process and saying we've got most of the answers, and just by the way, most of our churches look, that's apparent. You got one person up speaking, and everybody else is looking at the back of everyone else's heads, which is
mm,
sort of disrespectful. There's no native ceremonies like that, by the way. We're all looking at each other's faces,
mm,
even when we
mm,
have a square building. Um,
mm,
and so the idea is like, let's really get to know each other. This is
mm,
what it's about. This is what knowing and loving each other is. The way to love someone, the highest form
mm,
of love, I think, is vulnerability, because God is the most vulnerable being who exists. And Jesus certainly, if Jesus
mm,
portrayed God, then
mm,
we certainly see a whole life of vulnerability. And so when we become vulnerable to one another, people like to say, well, we only build at the speed of trust. Well, number one, the modern church doesn't give opportunities for that trust to build. But secondly, it just doesn't have opportunities to us really get to know each other except for a superficial level. And so when we build with this idea of being vulnerable because God is vulnerable, He created human beings to be vulnerable. And when we can
mm,
do that, we move at the speed of courage, right?
mm,
mm,
And the speed of courage can get us to a community and a real church, because that's what church is. It's community. It's not this building, this formality, and all these things that we do. And when we really love each other in relationship, um, that's when we begin to say, okay, we can, because we love each other, we can take the difference. In fact, we not just will put up with it, but we'll celebrate the difference,
mm,
because the difference is what makes us grow, both as human beings and both closer to the Creator. And so, Yeah, we've got to look at this unity and diversity, and and sort of like begin to go put less emphasis on doctrine and more emphasis on what we do together, and who we are together, um, and less on this, money into buildings and more money into people in our communities around us. I love that scripture. It says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." Most people come to a church and they taste and they try it for a little while, but then they realize some of the loneliest experiences they'll ever have are in church,
Yeah,
which is the opposite
Mm.
of what we're supposed to be. And
right.
so those are the kinds of things. But the other thing is to adapt. So, we think that when we build these structures, mostly built on homogeneity, right, on us being the same, that's
Mhm.
strong, but that's actually weak. Those are non-adaptive structures. They can't adapt when the world changes. They can't adapt when people begin to, when brown people become more popular than white people, and then
Mm,
other white
Mhm.
people have to go, well, we have to maintain our power because that's safety. You know, all of that's the opposite. We're missing what's really
Mhm.
important to our creator.
Mhm.
Um, and so, we have to learn to adapt. We have to adapt, get out of these, crazy buildings that we put so much money into. We need to get back into being in God's world. There's a number of churches now Wild Church, for example, who go out in nature and they leave their cell phones, at the door or wherever, and they put them all away, and they come out and they just enjoy God's beauty and read the scriptures, and maybe someone talks about that from a perspective, and these are the kinds of things, especially young people, are looking for. They
Mhm.
want community. They want Gen
Mhm.
X and Gen Z in particular, and I'm sorry, Gen Z and millennials in particular, but Gen X too. They want community. They don't want this, our old homophobias and polluting the earth and sexism and everything else. They realize, that they've been handed a bill of goods, and so the church isn't the one that's adapting and filling that need when we need to be that, because we have the power. And when I talk about
Mhm.
power, I'm not talking about power over. I'm talking about the
Mhm.
kind of power that Jesus talked about, which is real
yeah.
power. Because those of you who are the greatest are going to be the servants,
Mm,
right? That's power. Don't act like the Gentiles who lord over each other, but serve one another. We think that's some kind of an ethic. That's a lifestyle.
yeah.
Sorry, I kind of got the preaching there. So
Oh, no, this is so good, and I think you've given some really practical, wise. I mean, it's about community, it's about investing in people and relationships, and that requires courage and vulnerability and elevating voices that might not otherwise be heard and getting outside your building. I mean, you've just said some really important things, and, um, I'd like to take us to a place. I'd let me say this. I'd actually like to end there, but I'm not going to because I want to go to a place that you just barely mentioned earlier that I think is really important. So we take those concepts that you've talked about the church's role today, and then apply it to a place that I think the church has really, really wrestled with. And I mean local congregations, but I mean also denominational structures and such. And that is how we engage indigenous population, persons of color, and how we've created a dependency. And we've done it in our country, and you say we've done it in our churches, and we see it, right? So you've actually written a lot about this and about kind of a decolonized approach to Christian theology and what it means to think differently about how we engage this diversity and what it means to be the church. So, can you? And this is a hard place. This is a very hard place that, and we keep repeating patterns in our country, but also globally. And so, can you speak to that? And what are some ways to break those patterns?
yeah. Well, I think Jesus spoke to it when he spoke to what's known as the rich young ruler. Um,
Mm,
Sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and then you'll be healed.
mm,
We are at a place where we're not really willing to give up much.
Mhm.
We're not willing to give up those fancy buildings, you know. We're not willing to give up our doctrines. We're not willing to give up our money. We're not willing to give up our homogeneity. And above everything else, we're not willing to give up our over power
Hmm.
over, which is the
Power
opposite of
over.
what Jesus taught. And so, what does that look like to change that? That means some brave people have to be able to um, do some things that have never been done before, or have hardly ever been done before. That we hear about people like Saint Francis, and we idolize them, but how many people actually emulate him? How many get rid of everything and go live a simplistic lifestyle and get close to nature and that sort of thing? He was a very wealthy person. His father was a merchant, and so and we idolize Mother Teresa, and people like that. But they don't inspire us enough to do it because we're not willing to like look deep at that worldview. So what does it look like? It looks like leadership. Like one of the things, I'll tell you a story. I was in Canada one time, and well, actually, I was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and a Canadian pastor came up to me, and he had a big church, denominational church, and he said, "We have Native people. We have like 100 Native people that come." And he said, "But they don't stay. It's like a revolving door." And I said, "Well, how many Native people do you have in leadership?" He said, "Well, none." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Well, they're just not ready." I said, "How many are you getting ready?" And so basically, he puts his values, his Western values of what leadership is, on those people and says, "Now you have to conform to us in order to be considered a leader." I said, "Well, you're not going to get Native people to stay at your church because as soon as they walk in, it's the same old trope. It's the same story. They know what's going on. Our indigenous people are pretty savvy. We've been observing white folks for over 500 years now, and hopefully we've learned some things. But the thing is, everybody knows that game, and some people play it, and so then you have indigenous people who basically model, which is what most of our churches are, by the way, modeling the white values and the white Western way of doing things. And I call that a poor imitation of a bad model because we don't do this. They're low in giving, they're not growing, they're small. Like I pastored a church of about 70 Native people at one time. It wasn't all Native, but mostly Native.
Mhm.
It was a mega church. It was maybe one of the largest Native churches in the United States.
Uh-huh.
Um, but the thing is that they don't give, they don't grow, they don't, because they have a bad model. Instead of saying to the indigenous people, tap into the values that have been passed down by the creator to your people for so long, and let's see those values. What would a church look like? We built a church like that. We built an outdoor arbor with a fire in the middle and a dirt floor. And in the middle of winter in Carson City, Nevada, I'd get the nice building that the missionaries built for us. I'd get it all heated up, and then one of the little old Indian ladies would show up and go, "Pastor, we're going to meet outside, right?" So I'd have to go outside and start the fire, and put the tent sides down so the heat could stay in, and because that reflected their values, right? And so, but how many leaders are willing to do that? How many are willing to share or even give over leadership? And I realize in some denominational structures, I won't mention which ones, that's impossible the way that they're
Mhm.
structured, right? So even our structures have to be rebuilt. And what we're seeing in so many denominations is because of beliefs. Again, this is what happened starting in Europe with the Reformation, because the Reformation was just totally bought into Platonic dualism and beliefs as opposed to actions and loving actions, and so they killed each other, right? And then they
Mhm.
formed different denominations, and we continue to do that. And now we're seeing some of our major denominations basically split again because of a belief or a not belief. Whereas what Jesus taught is love one another. And so, and some, like this seems like for some people, I'm sure it's like, oh, that's so simplistic. That's exactly what it is. It is so simplistic. This is why Jesus was such a genius, because it's as simple as learning to love one another and not, you know, and being willing to accept one another, as Paul said, as Christ has accepted us, to accept our beliefs or not beliefs, whatever. You believe what you want, I'll believe what I want, but let's come together and love to each other as a community. So, are we willing to let go of these things? We can't be healed until we do. I had a student, a doctoral student, who came to me one time and he said, "I want to do a study on leadership under you." And I said, I can't. He said, "Why?" I said, "I've looked at every model of white leadership there is out there." I said, "None of them match our indigenous leadership." And he said, "Okay, thanks." He came back in 2 weeks and he said, "I want to do my dissertation on indigenous styles of leadership." And I said, "I don't know if anything's like that's been done before." And he said, "Great." And so he's writing a book right now, but his
Wow.
dissertation is wonderful. Um, and he discovered a lot of things when
Mm,
looking at it through his non-indigenous eyes and looking at indigenous leadership, and said it's almost the opposite of
mm,
what we would call,
mm.
white leadership. It's the idea that, you go to a native ceremony and the person who's in charge, you don't know, because they're not out front doing everything. They're behind
Yeah,
the scenes
wow.
kind of trying to hold things together, but you don't know. And everybody's looking at each other, and nobody's taking your children away somewhere else, and
Mm.
it's there's just so many differences. And so yeah, there's a lot to learn. Um I with the amount of humorous humorous, I wish it was humorous. The amount of humorous that's been built among our male Anglo folks, that they always have to be right. I don't know if that can happen. And so, it's up to, new folks coming through. It's up to women who are starting to gain places in the church, to do things. I always ask for, I have a male doctor right now, but it's the first male doctor I've had in years who would listen to me. And I always ask for woman doctors, and they would say, "Well, why do you want a woman doctor?" And I'd say, "Because they're the only ones that listen.
Mm.
The other ones already know everything, right?"
Ouch.
And I
Mm,
think it's the same, unfortunately, among not all, but much of our pastoral leadership.
mm,
Um, it's like they've already got the answer, so why do they need to listen?
mm.
When listening is the one of the highest forms of respect you can give another person.
Ah, so much. So much to lean into there. But I'm wondering, Randy, if we can take it a little bit personal. I'm
Okay.
wondering if you could talk about an Indigenous practice that's been particularly meaningful to you. And could you share that with us and share why it's been meaningful?
Yeah. So, I thought you were gonna ask me about, like, my marriage and things that I when you said personal, like, all right, well, my wife's
Not
writing
that
down
personal.
the beans. Um,
Not that personal.
yeah, and I am, it's taken, we've been married for 34 years now. And, I'm constantly learning from her and learning how to listen better. So this is not a practice that I have, I'm perfect at. Um, so yeah, like, there's simple personal ceremonies, and then there's public ceremony. Like I've been running Sweat Lodge for
Mm,
35 years, something like that.
mm,
Um, this is a Sweat Lodge is it's kind of like a sauna, kind of a combination of like a Swedish sauna and a Wednesday night prayer meeting, under these blankets and tarps, and if the two of them got married, they had an indigenous baby, right? Then that would be the Sweat Lodge. So so it's a place though where we pray and we sing and we share from our hearts and are vulnerable, and then at the same time our bodies are being purified, and it's completely dark in there, and people will share in that darkness their
mm,
vulnerabilities, And
Mhm.
it's so sacred that I've never, in all my years of doing and going to sweat lodges, I've never heard one person say what I hear every time there's an intimate moment among groups, similar groups outside the sweat among Europeans. And that is, I've never heard anybody say, now we need to make a covenant that whatever is shared in here, we don't share outside the circle.
Mm.
Nobody ever does that because it would be unthinkable. It's too
Yeah.
sacred a time, right? And so this is part of the protectionism that we built in to our systems. It's like I talk about, that sort of thing is similar to the idea of our national parks and things. We have to actually set aside places and make them without human inhabitants, which they'd had before, um, so that we don't destroy them. Right? It's like, what kind of people has so little faith in their own worldview that they know that they'll destroy everything if they don't set something aside? This is crazy, right? And this is the worldview that we've been handed, and the one that we've got to find our way out of. But on a personal side, I get up in the mornings. In our old days, our Cherokee people built their villages on rivers and creeks, and every morning they would go down to the water. The men would go to one place, and women would go to another place, and they would pray, and we do what's called water ceremony, and it was the way that every day began. And so I don't have a creek on my property, and I'm not sure I would actually go out to it if I did right now, but we got snow and ice. But I do have, something as simple as a sink. And so every morning I get up and I do that. I wash my face with the water. I pray. And sometimes I sing, and
Mm.
I pray for the day, for the things to go on. And so these are the kinds of things that are meaningful to me. Um, yeah.
Nice. Beautiful. So we're going to end our time with some rapid fire questions. So don't have to think too much about this, just a quick, what comes to mind. So, what is something most people generally misunderstand about Indigenous Americans or American Indians?
Probably the main things are humor. Um,
Mm.
they've been taught that Native people are stoic, and most
Mm.
people, my friend Brian McLaren
Mhm.
talks about the first time he was around Native people, where there's this a thing in Washington D.C. I forget what it was, but and um, there were four Native guys, and a friend called him and said, these guys hotel canceled. They don't have a place to stay. Can they stay with you? And he says, it's the best time I ever had in my life. It's just laughing and joking,
Nice.
and it surprised him, right? So I think that's a big surprise. Yeah, is that Native people are actually really funny, and that we like to laugh and have a good time.
Yeah. Great. What is one question that leaders can ask that invites them and their people, if you will, to have a more decolonized point of view?
Well, I think decolonization is just a process of peeling back the onions, right? The skins
Mm.
of the onion skins. There's one layer after the other, but once you get started, you really the whole thing unravels. So I think being open to questions, which is the about everything, but maybe the first question they should ask themselves is, where am I not being vulnerable?
Mm. Beautiful. Thanks. If we were to come visit you in Oregon, what would you be most excited to show us?
Probably a cook for you.
Oh, I'm I'm coming.
Both my both Edith and I cook, and she's a great cook, and I'm okay. So, but we like to cook for folks and eat, so we
Lovely.
have a meal together.
Beautiful gift of hospitality and welcome. So, finally, we're asking all of our guests this season a final question. So, as you consider the realities of this world, many of which we've named, and the leadership to which you have been called, what do you want to be remembered for?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good one. As you get older in age, you kind of start thinking about that stuff, right?
Mhm. What kind of ancestor do I want to be? Yeah.
Exactly. And right now the question I'm asking myself is, what kind of elder do I want to be?
Yeah.
Um, So I think probably if I leave my mark on this world, it would be, if I'm looking at my tombstone, maybe something like he had integrity.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah, integrated in all that you are and think and do. Wow, that's beautiful. Well, this has been such a rich and stimulating conversation. Thank you so much, Randy, for being with us today.
Thanks. I appreciate the questions. These were great questions, by the way. Thank you. You can have a conversation with one good question that will last forever, more than 100 questions that are shallow. So thank you for being willing to do that.
Amen and amen.